In this second part of the lecture, we are going to talk about gymnosperms. And gymnosperms are seed plants that have cones. We should define what a cone is. A cone is a modified stem, and depending on whether it is modified to be female or male, it can make either ovules or pollen. We will refer to the ones that make pollen as pollen cones, and those that make ovules as ovule cones. In both cases, we can see it's a modified stem because there's this central axis going up through the middle, and then there are things coming off to the sides. In the case of our pollen cone on the left, there are sacs of pollen, which I'm circling here. On the ovule cone on the right, we can see that there are scales. These scales aren't fully developed. This is a light microscope image, so this is an immature cone. And sitting on each of these scales is an ovule, which I'm circling right here in the box, and there's a couple more ovules over here on the left-hand side. Some of them are obscured by the way the picture was made, and so we can't see them as clearly on the other scales. Ovulate cones, or ovule cones, of course make ovules. And ovules, if they are fertilized and developed, will become seeds. The process of making the cone becoming pollinated and then fertilized, and the seed developing can take a couple of years. So the ovule cones have to be sturdy and persistent. In contrast, the pollen cones only need to last long enough to make pollen and then let that pollen disperse. So over here on the right where we see pollen cones, there's about 24 cones in this picture. And you can see that these are fairly small, maybe a couple of centimeters long, and they are flimsy. So these are easy to break, they're brittle, and they're ephemeral, meaning that they fall off quickly. What is pollen? We've used the word and we've talked about it informally, but we should define it. We can say that pollen is a male gametophyte inside a protective coat, or a pollen wall. And the male gametophyte, remember, is going to be a multicellular haploid generation. By male, we know that it's going to be making sperm, not eggs. And because the male gametophyte is enclosed within this protective coat, this is going to allow pollen to be dispersed in various ways depending on the species, sometimes by wind or insects or other animals like birds. The male gametophyte inside the pollen can stay dormant until it reaches an ovule on a cone or until it reaches a flower if it's from a flowering plant. So this means that it's going to be easier for the male gametophyte to time when to mature and when to make its pollen based on when it's likely going to be near a receptive egg. Once that pollen germinates, then it's going to grow outside of its wall. It will come out, and depending on the type of pollen, it will make a tube or something a little bit less tube-like that will eventually grow towards where the egg is. At that point, it's going to release sperm that, depending on the group, might swim or might just be transported to the egg where fertilization can occur. We are going to talk about 3 different groups of gymnosperms: the cycads, the ginkgos, and the conifers. There are some weird sort of gymnosperms that you're unlikely to encounter that we will not talk about. We'll start with the cycads. Cycads are these cool-looking plants shown over here on the right. They look sort of like palms and sort of like ferns. The leaves especially have a fern-like appearance. They are pinnately compound. They also make unusual looking cones that would appear down here, but that's not shown in this picture. Cycads are mostly tropical, though some will grow in temperate areas. There are not many species, and some are rare or endangered. For many species, most of the plant is toxic if it is eaten by humans or pets. However, for some species, then the pith, remember the pith is the center of the stem, that can be removed, and then after the toxins are leached out of it, it can be eaten. That occurs especially in some Asian cultures. We use cycads primarily for landscaping. They have a sort of cool dinosaur-like look. They can also be grown as houseplants, but if you do that, then keep them away from your pets because you don't want them to be poisoned. The second group that we'll talk about are the ginkgos. There is only one living or non-extinct species, and it's native to Eastern Asia, especially areas like China. So one species left. It used to be more abundant, and there used to be more species that occurred more broadly. This would be back in just after the Carboniferous period, so just after the period where the lycophytes and ferns were the dominant tree types. The ginkgos, something interesting about them is that there are separate male and female trees. The female trees make these fleshy fruit-like structures. They're not true fruits because these aren't flowering plants. But they make things that appear like fruits, they're fleshy, and they smell like vomit. So we usually try to avoid planting female ginkgos. Ginkgos are common street trees. They are used frequently, including in the upstate of South Carolina, where I'm located, because they can withstand pollution, and they have an attractive, interesting structure, as shown down here. However, as we said, the females make those messy fruit-like cones that smell bad, so we try to plant only male trees. You will occasionally find a female, because it's hard to tell until the tree matures whether it's male or female, and our tests are imperfect. While the outside of the female ginkgo cone is stinky, the ginkgo seeds are edible. They're used as a treat in Asian cooking. However, they do contain toxins, so they're not something that should be eaten in large doses or frequently over time. Too much exposure can be toxic. And this is just an example. This is a Thai dish with some coconut and some ginkgo. We'll next talk about the conifers. Conifers are trees with needle-like or awl-like shapes. And so the leaves over here on the left, we can say look like awls. Like so. Other ones like pine are going to look needle-like. Maybe there'd be a few needles together in a bundle like this. Most species of conifers are evergreen. That means that there's no one time when all of the leaves fall off. It does not mean that the leaves last forever. Every so often one of these leaves will fall off. But meanwhile, other leaves are being made, so the branches are never completely bare. Conifers are going to include pine trees. Conifers, they're not all huge, but there are some examples of huge and ancient conifers, some of our largest trees. In fact, redwoods, I believe, are our tallest tree, and they can reach 115 meters tall. That's nearly 400 feet. And for those of you in South Carolina, that's probably 3 or even 4 times taller than the tallest trees around here. The largest conifers have trunks that reach 12 meters across. That's 40 feet. That is probably wider than the typical classroom. And the oldest known trees are conifers. The oldest known ones are more than 5,000 years old. So if you imagine what was happening 2,000 years ago, more than double that, and the trees are older than that still. So pictured over here on the right is a bristlecone pine, and some of these have been dated to be more than 5,000 years old. There's a lot of contention about how old trees are. For some trees it's easy to tell. For really old trees, when they start to rot out in the middle, then it becomes guesswork. So you'll see some dates that say the oldest trees are younger than this, and other dates saying that they are older. Conifers are important to humans. We use them for several purposes. We use them for paper pulp. We use them for lumber. So most housing material, for example, would be made out of pines. If you go buy a 2x4, that will be pine. Remember that pines and other conifers are softwood because the xylem does not contain any fibers along it. We occasionally use these for food, and examples of this were that introduction slide where we saw pine nuts. Those are not true nuts, but they do come from pine trees. They're actually seeds, not nuts. Also juniper berries, which we saw on an earlier slide, the blue-looking cones. They are not technically berries because berries are a kind of fruit, and only flowering plants make fruit, not cone-bearing plants. But they do look like berries, and they are what we use for the flavoring of gin. Probably for most of us, the place where we will encounter gymnosperms the most, or conifers, is in landscaping. And so here's a couple of examples. We can use low-growing juniper shrubs as a ground cover in some areas, and here's an example of that. There's also various tall, narrow conifers. We can use cycads in a garden for that prehistoric tropical look. And then, because many gymnosperms, and especially conifers, keep their leaves throughout the season, they can be useful for providing a windbreak, a visual break, or a sound break. For example, if you have obnoxious neighbors, you don't want to see their yard, then you can plant a wall of them, and during both winter and the other seasons, there will be a barricade to divide the space. Some final thoughts. The transition from a dominant sporophyte generation, or the transition to a dominant sporophyte generation, is one of the major changes in the evolution of plants. And so we talked about that in the first video. Second, seeds are important for allowing dispersal and dormancy. They also provide protection, and so that's a major innovation. Seeds are a large part of the human diet, and they were instrumental in humans becoming so populous. Finally, pines continue to be very important in South Carolina. About half of our forested land is pine forest, and forestry in South Carolina is a multi-billion-dollar industry, so it is obviously a big part of our state. In our next video, we are going to move on and start talking about the flowering plants, or the angiosperms.